I'm here with Marco Bertini and Oded Koenigsberg, eminent professors and authors of the brand new book, which I have right here, The Ends Game. I have read it in detail, every single word, paragraph, chapter, footnote, and I've reviewed it for Strategy and Business, and it's a cracking read. I'm not their agent, but it is a cracking read. It's a fantastic book, highly stimulating, highly practical. What we want to try and do today is to sort of delve into some of the detail that perhaps you can't read in the book and get their own personal take and reflections on it. So thank you guys for joining me today, and congratulations again. So I'm always interested in motivation, right? Motivation. What motivated you to write this book at all, and why particularly now?
Okay, so I'll take this one. Thanks for having us, David. So I was thinking about this. I think there's probably two reasons why we wanted to write this book. Oded may add a few after that. I think Oded and I both had the pleasure individually and together to work with a lot of very creative companies. We're both professors in marketing departments, so we care about how organizations think about their customers and how they provide value to these customers. So we've had the pleasure to work with very, very sophisticated companies. And we're always curious and a little bit frustrated, to tell you the truth, that when it comes to taking all that goodness for customers and converting it to value for the organization in the form of revenue, irrespective of whatever objective the company has, right? They're definitely not as creative and definitely not as sophisticated, right? And one particular way we can see that is in their thoughts about, well, hold on a second, as a company, what are we literally going to earn revenue on? And for most, they don't even think about this question, and they just say, oh, I make this product, I create this service, let's just put money on that, right? And so they don't go through that very strategic sort of thought. And then I think the second reason is, increasingly, we see lots of work out there about subscriptions, about memberships, about pay-go, about performance, and all of these different business models have literatures on their own, but nobody's really tried to tackle them and sort of say, okay, do they fit in one theory? You know, David, do they fit in one theory? Do they make sense? And guess what? A customer perspective, yes, you can actually put them all on a line, you know, and take it from there.
Very good. That makes a lot of sense. That makes leaving money on the table. We'll come back to the topic of waste. You're passionate, if not, I would say, obsessed with the concept of waste in the exchange between customers and organization. So you've touched on it there, Marco, but let's dive deeper. You talk about the shift from, if you like, promises to proof in the overall book. Tell me a little bit more about the premise, you know, the actual argument you want to convey and the shift you're trying to encourage, I guess, leaders to take.
So the main premise of the book in this sense is that we believe that firms need to rethink the way they are making pricing decisions. Decision on pricing should be part of the design of a product or a service and not an aftermath. So in many cases, what we've seen that the pricing decision come in the end of the process when the service is already there or the product is already designed. As a result, there are very few, the space state of all the option is limited. And many times companies are basically channeled and narrowed and charged for ownership. And what we find out, we thought, there is a space, there is some inefficiency, there is some waste that is created, as you mentioned earlier, in different type of waste, and companies, in order to improve their performance and actually the dialogue with the consumers, the understanding of consumers about the product that they receive and the value that it creates, firms need to redesign the pricing decision and think about that. And what we try to do here is actually create a framework that allows managers to rethink the way they think about pricing.
In some ways, you sort of, in some level, and I say this kindly, in some ways it sounds like sort of common sense, doesn't it, in terms of what you're trying to achieve. But you also talk about the power of technology, because I guess once you've, up until now, once you and I have purchased something, effectively there hasn't been much information, right, around how it's actually used. But you talk a lot in the book around how technology is enabling, I guess, a brighter picture of usage, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So technology, for me, technology is definitely an enabler. And it's basically, and obviously IT, and specifically we are talking about different types of sensors, whether are the enable managers in many industries to monitor better the value that consumers generate from products or services. But in the end of the day, for me, it's basically, it's sufficient but not necessary. What the necessary is the recognition of firms that consumers basically generate value, and there is a gap between what consumers are generating to what they are paying for.
Right.
And IT in this sense, technology enables many companies, many industries to pick on it.
Right. So in some ways, yeah. So I always like it when academics always bring the necessary and sufficient conditions. I'm glad we've got that. That makes me feel sort of settled now. But it's a mindset. So it's a mindset shift, right? Because I guess there's a mindset of leaders, whether that's leaders at the top of the organisation, in the marketing departments, in the commercial areas, where they're sort of it's sort of proprietary, it's sort of a winner loser type mindset. But that's quite a shift to say, okay, if you're going to get more value as a customer from my product, you've got to not necessarily own it. And you talk about ownership a lot. You don't have to own it. You can use it in many other ways. And that's a prominent theme. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off that. So, yeah. I mean, again, we wanted to start from the customer's perspective, right? And I think if you think about the customer and you think about the customer wanting to buy goods and services to get something out of it, the ends that we talk about in the book, right? Then you yourself and say, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions? And we'll say, well, first thing, that customer has to have access to your product or service. If there's no access, there's nothing to be had, right?
Yeah.
Okay, conditional on that, what comes next? Well, they have to consume it, right? If it just sits there and they don't consume it, you can't derive potentially value. And conditional on access and consumption, what is the last necessary and sufficient condition? Well, it has to perform. You can consume something that you don't like very much, so it doesn't give you any value. So when you look at it that way, right, this is the flow for a customer to derive value. So if you look at it from that perspective, you think to yourself, where does ownership fit into this? For the firm perspective, it's great because if I flog something off, right? And it's completely risk-free for me. But ownership is probably a pretty poor way of giving access to people, right? We've seen it in big ticket items, cars, apartments, medical equipment, and also in convenience items, right? The things like Dollar Shave Club, Instant Ink for HP. Whenever there is a convenience problem, that's an access problem. And I don't want to go out and buy ink at the nearest store. If it comes to my door, that's a lot better. Yeah. So it's that kind of customer perspective.
So that ownership, I guess, once you've, from a company, but that's a big shift in the ways companies operate, because once you've, frankly, as you say, flogged it, sold it, yes, there'll be after sales and so on. But if you have an ongoing, whether it's a subscription model, it's much more dynamic, ongoing activity. You have to do upgrades and so on. That's a pretty big rewiring of an organization from one which effectively is a product manufacturer and then a bit of after sales to one where there's a continual exchange of both data and engagement. And frankly, if you're not improving the product and responding, well, these customers will see whether they're meeting their ends or not, and then they'll shift, right? It's quite a big shift in organizational dynamics and capabilities, right?
There is, yeah. So in the book kind of divides itself in three parts, and the last part is really about action and what the organization must do. To your point about sort of managing this transition. And by the way, at no stage do Oded ever say, "Hey, you business, stop selling that box and sell performance." There's quite a long way between one and the other.
Yeah, sort of, I thought that was very nuanced of you, because actually it would have been easy to say, "Hey, here's a new model, flick." And actually, many books and many consultants, even consultants and academics, they don't focus on the transition very much. They tend to focus on the new model. Forget the old model. And by the way, you suddenly wake up one day and you leap. The transition bit's very hard, right?
For majority of the companies, the transition from the old model of ownership to pay per performance per outcome is impossible. I think actually thinking about it and trying to think what we call proxies for that along the way of the journey is the important part. And managers should understand first, I think the first importance is really understanding the value that they create. Whether it's a service, it doesn't have to be product. We can talk about education. We talk actually with some of the examples are about education and other services, which usually we think in a different way. And think about the value it creates, and then try to think, how do we minimize this, what we call waste, without going to ownership? In many cases, actually, managers cannot do otherwise and need to defer to the ownership model. But in some other cases, they may find some other ways to improve their the current pricing products.
Why is, just going back to your point right at the beginning, that you said that it's, you know, it would be impossible to shift to a pay performance model. Why isn't it possible if you have the right resources, time, inclination?
So I think there are two or three main obstacles. The first one is probably the measurement. With all the accuracy of IT technology and sensors, it's not easy to measure every sense of performance. There is not always agreement between buyers and sellers. There is the moral hazard issue of basically some people have a different perception about performance. Yeah. There is attribution or attribution issue of who really is who have to be credited for the success, and more than that, who should be credited for the failure or should be blamed for the failure. Yeah. And I think these are the biggest obstacles for a full transition into the pay per performance or pay for outcome models.
I mean, at the same time, David, sorry, at the same time, there are enough, when we sat down and thought about the structure of this book and we started looking for examples, there is enough hints and signals across very, very different markets, right? To sort of say to you, okay, maybe right now in your industry, you just don't have the things that Ed was saying, right? You don't have the measurement, the right sort of mindset, but you know, that technology is creeping up on you. It's not going in the opposite direction. Yeah. It's going in that direction, right? So that technology is creeping up on you. And at the very least, and this is something I always tell my executive audiences, at the very least, you want to have thought about this problem and say, you know what? No, I can't do it now. Let's shelve it for a while, right? Right. Because before you know it, it'll be with you, you know? It's too late.
It's very much, when I read it and reread it, and you know, I delve deep as I do. I'm a very diligent person in that respect. It read as much as a strategy book as a marketing book, and there were aspects of the hues of leadership. You know, there's lots of behavioural science, there's a good operational research, given your mutual background. Come back to some of the battles and fights you know that had as we close. But you touched on examples, and you had a refreshing range of examples, you know, from sort of micro insurance to fashion to mining, shaving, which clearly you're both practicing. You know, and you know, and the list goes on. Education, you mentioned quite a range of examples, and refreshing the fact that it wasn't just you know, one country examples. You had a range of different countries. Which out of all the examples for you both, I want to hear from both of you, were the most stimulating, where you thought, wow, that's innovative, that's different, that's a game changer?
I'll go first, maybe Oded. So to me, and maybe it's biased given the industry that I'm in, but to me, the educational space, and you know this, David, because we talked about this before, it completely blows my mind, right? Because, you know, we are in the sort of in the industry of making people learn, engaging them to learn, right, about things, and it's probably as intangible as it gets, you know, together with health, maybe it's one of those really intangible religion, or those really intangible sort of industries. And seeing companies that very diligently sit down and think to themselves, we're promising the world that we make everybody learn. We don't promise the world that we'll sell you a textbook. No, we promise learning. That's how we position ourselves. We can't just say that and then, you know, turn our back to it, right? And so very diligently thinking about, what does learning mean? How do I break it down into outcomes? How can I measure it? How can I hold myself to account for these things? And we're talking about, in some cases, 3, 4, 5, an ongoing process. It's not like, but so to me, it's mind-blowing in a sense, because again, these are 4 or 5 years projects. I mean, you have to have a certain purpose behind you, a certain leadership behind you. This is not
and be willing to take the flack along the way, because I know in that particular example, you know, there's controversy in terms of, because, you know, if you're a teacher in that example, you know, is it the teacher? Is it the book? Is it both? Is it the environment? And obviously in the UK at the moment, we have some fairly contentious things going on about exams. You know, these are contentious issues. It's not just a low profile shift that you're talking about. And in that case, you also, you said 3 to 5 years and longer, you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to be able to tell the story, because it either may be bumpy, but you also need supporting shareholders and others to say, hey, you know what, there's an element of risk to this. I mean, in my view, it's a higher value, higher risk, I may be wrong, but higher value, higher risk sort of proposition. You have to have the support to make that change.
And you know, to complement Marco here, and I agree with him, I think education is education, and for me, healthcare, the industries with the highest social impact were the main motivation here. Because you can see a real shift there in both of them. So one of them is more sophisticated than the other in terms of pricing, but you see the same type of shifts and searching for a better model that really reflect the value at what it creates. And it's a journey. It's a tough one here because of the complexities of both industries. Yeah. The other source of motivation came from the B2B, where the efficiency of both the buyers and the sellers in some sense dictate these solutions. So we can see leadership there in many of the examples where there is almost like a agreement between both sides. We need to find something more reliable to do so, and and I think that's a great source of examples for other industries as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. Since when I look through the examples, some of them date back, as you're saying, both saying in different ways, some way, right? So some of them date back to 2014, 2015, and yet and earlier, right? And earlier. Yeah. Yet the logic is compelling. The opportunity, I think, is compelling as well. If you were, I hope, a viewer, a listener, a reader, and actually thinking, I get it, love it, I'm inspired by the thinking, the concepts, and some of the examples. I don't want to copy the examples, but I see what they've done. Where do you start? Where do you start? I know you've covered this before. I want to get practical here. You've read it, you get it, you want to do it. Where do you actually start?
So for me, again, the starting point as a manager, and I assume, David, I assume you refer to managers when you ask
people in a business, running a business or a business unit.
Business unit. So for me, again, and I'm going back to a point I made earlier, it's a recognition. There is a need to shift and change the way we think about our business in general, and specifically about the pricing decision. I mean, you know, there is one common thing that Marco and I said all the time, that consumers are in the center of strategies for the last decade or more, in many attributes. When we design products, when we design services, we hear the voice of the consumers. And at the point when we look at pricing, consumers are not in the center. There is no dialogue with consumers. So understanding that we need to create this dialogue with consumers and then find a way out to do it a credible way, I think that's a starting point of managers. That's where they have to start and look for new strategies. And for more than that, I want to strengthen a point Marco said earlier. For me, I think it's a moment of truth for managers, because in many cases, for two reasons. One, because I believe that the evolution of industry will lead to the fact that leading companies will go this way, go this path, and other managers, if they won't do that, they'll be in this, will be under pressure, competitive pressure. The second reason, because I think that thinking about it really faces managers with understanding of the value that they create to consumers. And in many cases, actually, it's different. There is a gap between what they think they create to what they actually create and what consumers are thinking.
Just let me follow up on what Oded was saying, because this is still surprising me to this very day. And I don't know why it is still surprising, but it does. You go to an organization and again, this goes back to the idea of sort of being very creative in making up value propositions, but then maybe not thinking about it as deeply on the back end. It's a really difficult discussion to have in many organizations, especially the high-tech ones. You know, what outcomes do we deliver to customers? Because, you know, with the high-tech, and I'm generalizing here, I understand, but with the high-tech companies, you know, their head is in the R&D, right? It's like, better, let's make it more bright, more shiny, more sparkling, more features, more functions, right? And like, when you stop and think, okay, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve here? And then let's work our way backwards. That is a difficult thing. So intuitive, I think, but a difficult thing to really kind of, you know, get your hands around, you know?
So how do you do that? So I get the mindset shift and what you're trying to do, but how do you, or what have you seen or perhaps experience of how you actually start? So you want to think about the value, the outcomes for consumers. You have a mindset of humility and curiosity to say, actually, I'm open to the fact that I don't know. So that's a big mindset shift. But how do you actually, do you do it on your own? Do you do it in teams? Do you do it with customers? How do you get over that, to that point where you actually understand or re-understand value and understanding outcomes if you haven't done it before?
I reckon you totally have to do it. I think I'm answering also for that here. I think you totally have to do it with the customers at some point having their input. Okay. We seem to find for our research for the book actually that a lot of times this happens because you kind of have to. There's a competitor that comes in and all of a sudden there's a Dollar Shave Club around and you're Gillette, and all of a sudden you're thinking, maybe we
wakes you up. Yeah.
It's a classic thing, right? I mean, there's no, we're not talking about a thing you have to solve tomorrow, right? We're talking about a thing that kind of creeps on you. So sometimes until you have like the threat in front of you, it's hard to get people's agenda empty to get together. Right?
Yeah. I get that. Now you've been looking at this topic in all its different shapes and forms for many years, right? But even when you're producing a book and you know doing more, going into the research in more detail, having debates between the two of you, what surprised you after, you know, once you've gone through the process? What were the moments in the process of writing the book that surprised you around the topic? It may come about the individual as well. That'd be really interesting. But that's about the topic first.
So you know, it started literally with a dialogue that Marco and I established, and you mentioned and you alluded we are coming from slightly different backgrounds, and what surprised me in many cases that whenever we thought we solved an issue and we explained it, there was another layer that we have to uncover. So the dialogue about some of this concept, which seems like exhausted, was an ongoing, and actually it took much longer than I expected. Right.
Very good. Marco?
I mean, this is going to sound boring, but I echo exactly what he said. I think it's surprising how many layers you can go through. And it's frustrating. And here I'm going to recall a friend of mine that once, a very wise friend of ours, who once said to us, hey, a book is not a finished product. Don't think that, you know, by the time you publish the book, that is the last word anybody's ever going to say on this topic, right? Or even yourself are going to say on this topic. So you have to cut it somewhere. Yeah. And then for me, as an academic, it was like, oh, no, I just want the answer. You know, we have all the holes are plugged, right? And because Oded and I were having sometimes very heated debates about, you know, how...
Really? I thought you were both very passive individuals. There you go. Yeah.
Surprising, right? And then, so that advice really stuck with me, like, okay, you know, let's push if we think it's really worth pushing, but at some point we'll close it, right? And as a matter of fact, we've learned things after the book that now we talk about in our classrooms that didn't make the book, right? It's like that.
The one thing I noticed I'm not a serial book reviewer, but I read, you know, pretty a lot. I think one thing that a number of people are doing, and I guess it's a little bit of a suggestion, is whether it's online resources, playbooks, activities, having that ongoing dialogue with not just your readers but others, where effectively you're learning from them. Whereas I find some authors do treat it as, hey, this is here it is, I'm sort of done, and sort of the topic's over. Whereas, as you say, there's a long way to run on, you know, on this one. What do you most, at a personal level, sort of sincere level? This is a big endeavor, right? I imagine it's involved a lot of sacrifice, a lot of heartache, and you know, it's a big endeavor. I know, writing a book. What are you most proud of? What are you most proud of?
Well, then you go first.
I didn't want to take it again. What I'm most proud of is, you know, Marco and I are both researchers in the last 15 to 20 years, and we write a lot of papers. And papers are more limited in the scope. So I think I'm more, and you know, we dive really deep, and we dig, and we learn, and we exhaust it, and we go to the next topic. Here it was, I'm most proud of the fact that we were able basically to create a larger, a more broader framework, which took, and for me that was a different way of thinking. So for me, it was a new challenge. It was one of the largest academic challenges that I faced, even though it's different than papers.
Yes.
But I must admit, one of the most rewarding ones. Again, the completion and understanding that you basically exhausted the topic completely, which is different than what we do in research.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think on my end, I think it's somewhat similar. I mean, you know, after so many years working together, it's like there's a bit of symbiosis going on here. But I think it's somewhat similar in the sense that, but also a little bit nuanced, different, in the sense that there was a point in the process of the book where I remember having these whiteboards full of different examples and stick figures representing consumers and all those things, right? And at some point, we kind of looked at each other and we sort of said, wait, they fit in a line. They make sense, right? There was, you know, it's this sort of stereotypical aha moment. There was definitely recall. And I don't know, as an academic, I'm kind of proud of sort of sorting through that mess, which is a mess in a nice way. It's like, well, the business world is a messy one, right? I try to go through that mess and sort of say, okay, this kind of makes sense. And then running it through people, and they also, yeah, that sort of makes sense. And, you know, kind of distinct all that. There's a lot of work on subscriptions, a lot of work on membership. Some folks are saying that's the end of the game. There's a lot of work on pay as you go, a lot of work on pay performance, but trying to put all that together in a way that doesn't cut corners, right? And says, oh, you completely dumped that idea just to make it fit. To me, that personally, that was kind of like, okay, that's great. I really felt sort of fulfilled in a sense.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I mean, as you know, I've delved into the topic in aspects of it, but I've not covered all of it. And there's part of me, frankly, would love more on the performance model side of it, because that's where I focused. And there is more to come, no doubt. But what I commend you for is the coherence of the overall argument and the overall framework. That's the first time I've seen, you know, the different elements of waste, how you build the argument up, and how you use a range of case studies to illustrate it that are sufficiently different to give different angles and nuances on, you know, the access points or the performance points and so on. The other thing is the nuance and the thoughtfulness around the leadership journey and the manager and the organizational journey it takes. The action, your last section, the action section is thoughtful, because I find too often it's a sort of 10-point plan, go off and do it, just execute it, and just, you know, we're done. Life, and I've known it because I've run businesses and I've also advised business, is not like that. It's a passionate book. I mean, I can sense, not just because I know you both, but it's a passionate book. I mean, this is, some books are quite dry, which is sort of, here's the logic, here's the argument, here's the case study, just go and do it. I mean, you repeat certain bits consciously, so it's a bit like a great speech. You know, you hear a speech and the message is repeated. It's sort of intensity sort of to it. And as you say, most of all, I guess, is that a number of the areas, health being and education being the two prime areas, this really matters to people. Getting this right really matters to people. It's not just sort of shareholder value. So I commend you both. I'm like your agent now, but this is the book. I think it's fantastic. Look at my review, and congratulations. And I guess, as you say, you've just begun. So this is now not just in terms of marketing the book, but in terms of the evolution of the stories and the research. And a big credit to you both. So many congratulations.
Thank you very much, David.